always makes me laugh when they say, come out anytime you want. You can have a lovely time. You'll go out on a speedboat on a sunny day, see beautiful big fish, because they're never going to take you to where the sad ones are, with the eroded noses and the sores all over them.
Welcome back. Last episode, we had Ben Hadfield from Mowi tell us that as far as the environmental damage from Mowi was concerned, everything was fine. So we're going to take those glittering claims out the back and give them a damn good drubbing. I'm joined by two absolute warriors this week who spent years fighting on the front line. Nick Underdown, Scotland Director at WildFish, and Ailsa McLellan from Loch Bloom. Let's see how well the industry fairy tale holds up. Season 3 of The Last Salmon is in partnership with Loop, driving change for wild fish and wild places.
The following episode was recorded before the Scottish Government's recent endorsement of a private agreement between salmon farming industry body Salmon Scotland and Fisheries Management Scotland, the organisation representing Scotland's salmon fishery boards and trusts. Under the agreement, funds raised will go towards projects supporting Scotland's wild salmon. However, WildFish maintains that environmental harm in public waters should be addressed through regulation, not private deals, and argues the arrangement creates little meaningful deterrent for salmon farming companies, with proposed penalties for fish escapes appearing far lower than those seen in other countries.
You are one of those people. You live very locally to a Mowi fish farm. Talk us through what it's like to live in proximity of a working open net salmon farm.
Yep, it's like living next to any heavy industry. I mean, we're noticing huge changes locally at the moment since Mowi bought Westeros Fisheries, which they still trade under. So initially all salmon farms hand-fed, and then it's gone over to this feed barge system. So a feed barge is like a little ferry almost is what it looks like. And they have pipes that they blast the pellets down. And the noise of these ricocheting pellets carries for miles literally over the water. So our little farm in front of where we live doesn't have a feed barge at the moment, but Mowi have been lobbying to get one. But the community has been up in arms because we don't want the noise and we don't want the microplastics. And so instead of that, we've got cannons, which is as bad as it sounds. They put this kind of blasting gun in a thing of feed pellets, and then the guys can squirt that out over the pen group. We've also got generators that run 24/7 through a large part of the winter to power lights through the night to affect the maturation of fish, and through the summer to power compressors to pump oxygen because they can't get enough oxygen out the sea here. We've got work boats gunning their engines every day of the week. This last weekend, they were starting before 7 a.m. both days. And this week, they have been power washing constantly. And actually, I didn't realise power washing was so loud. And that is because I think they're inviting the public out this weekend to have a look at this little prototype feed barge that's going to be a different model from the initial one they wanted. They literally clean house before people go out on sites. That's why it always makes me laugh when they say, come out anytime you want. You can have a lovely time. You'll go out on a speedboat on a sunny day, see beautiful big fish, because they're never going to take you to where the sad ones are, with the eroded noses and the sores all over them. Incidentally, we've seen footage come out today of the Mowi site in Little Loch Broom next to me of their brood stock pens. So these are big full-size salmon, blind, open sores down their sides, sea lice all over them. This is the norm. And Ben Hadfield can say his lines as much as he wants. And I have no doubt the farmers in the pens care about the fish. I've worked on a fish farm. Nobody wants to see animals suffering. But at the end of the day, about Mowi on the whole is about the bottom line and about how much money they make. Mm-hmm. So that's what it's like living beside Mowi.
Thank you, Ailsa. That was a really, really colourful and informative description.
Sorry, I do have another thing to say. I've got so
Go
much
on.
to say. You'll have to shoot me. I think silence is really important, especially in the Highlands. People come for the peace. If you look on Mowi's website and see where their sites are, you'll notice that is the only industry in a lot of these areas. You can walk out to, do you know what a bothy is in Scotland?
Yes.
Yeah, so yes. You can walk out
a small rural dwelling.
That anyone can stay in. For
those who don't.
Yeah.
Anyone stay in it, yeah.
So you can walk, I thought I'll take my kids out to the first bothy. We went to one called Craig that you walk out from Diabeg. This is about as in the middle of nowhere as you can get. So we hauled our asses out for 2 or 3 hours, and As we approached the bothy, we could just hear the noise of fish pellets blasting down pipes. Got to the bothy, and then on the beach in front of that were vast lengths of black feed pipe. So Ben can say all he wants, that litter is not an issue, and maybe fish farm litter isn't an issue, given what Scotland produces as a whole. But it shows you just how disengaged he is what happens locally, because it's a huge issue locally. We've got kids groups in Ullapool that literally spend all their time picking up litter on the beaches. And they've been campaigning Mowi and in direct contact with Ben for getting to put labels on the pipes and things. And during your podcast, he said they were doing that. So I asked them if they'd heard that he was going to do that, and they said no. If he's labelling parts of the fish farm equipment, it would be nice to know where and when. He also said they were going to put metal joints onto the feed pipes to reduce plastic erosion. Where's that happening? You know, he states things, but there's not any evidence from what we can see that these things are happening. And I think if they were doing it, they'd have publicised it.
Well, it's so good of you to share that, Ailsa, because obviously up there in the wilds of Scotland, very few people actually are around to see any evidential footage, content, photographs of the work they're actually doing. So if anyone's... What's the name of the beach that you were on with in that bothy, the way where you saw that washed up pipe?
That bothy's called Craig, but you could find that black feed pipe over many, many beaches here. There used to be an email address you could report it to, and the nearest salmon farm was meant to pick it up. But often these are quite remote places. It's hard for the public to get back out and see if it's gone.
Right. Well, if anyone from Mowi is listening, then go and clean up your mess. You know where Ailsa is talking about. And Ailsa, can I ask you, any time that you're up there, you're a local, and you know what you're looking for, and you know what you're talking about, any time you see any of this detritus, any evidential content that you can send to us, we'd only be too happy to share it with the public, which will hopefully help hold Mowi to account and to the promises that Ben indeed made on this show.
And the children's groups, the Ullapool Sea Savers specifically, that spend their time picking it up, have got many images of that. And another thing that's almost worse is these polystyrene beads that are often used to float in the flotation for cage groups. I mean, they have been a huge issue over the years in this loch. You see,
aquaculture argues that it is supported locally by communities, and to hear from a local community in the vicinity of Mowi to tell their stories like you have is baffling, isn't it? I mean, in order to defend that, what percentage of your local community are employed by Mowi and presumably would therefore defend them?
So there are jobs, and nobody is dismissing how important that is in an area like this. And well, every job is important, but it's absolute nonsense that fish farms are providing jobs for the community in the way that they state they are. So locally, we had 22 people less employed since Mowi took over Westeros Fisheries. That's just in the sites around here. That doesn't include the Dingwall processing factory that they shut down when they bought Westeros Fisheries. So even though there was less people employed, their revenue went up. And I mean, this is a kind of pattern across the industry. It's called improving productivity, isn't it? And Mowi have these centralised feeding systems now. So there's one in Fort William, and they have stated that they want all their mainland sites serviced by these. So the more they automate, the less jobs it is. And just a bit about the money they get, I don't know if this is another kind of branch of the conversation, but they get so much taxpayers' money, and that would be much better spent on a locally owned business where the revenue would stay within the community and not on a foreign-owned multinational. You know, we've got fishermen, shellfish farmers. This money going to them would make a genuine huge difference to people's lives. And I think Ben Hadfield calling locals' objections mudslinging is really dismissing the legitimate concerns of people. When they put in for this feed barge, they had over 70 people turn up at a public meeting. And I don't know how many objecting letters were written to Highland Council, but it was enough to stop them proceeding along the lines that they were. And there's a little film online you can watch and just see the strength of feeling against that proposal. I mean, it wasn't helped by Mowi sending out one of their employees to the residents where I live who lied to us and said they wouldn't ask for a feed barge if we allowed their bigger cage group to go through, and then they automatically did. And when I've raised this with Ben in person, he said I was painting a picture. I was trying to paint a narrative. I'm not, these are just facts.
It's extraordinary. Nick?
100% endorse and agree with what Ailsa said. I think that when you listen to, and it's not just Ben Hadfield, it tends to be just representatives of the salmon farm industry, because there are one or two of them, and they do push a narrative, and it's not plugged in. So it's either that they are out of touch with the communities within which they're operating, or they are trying to push a narrative that is not actually factually accurate. You know, the number of times I've heard this attempt to smear the word activist and, you know, paint everyone who has got a concern about salmon farming as an activist. I mean, first of all, it's not a bad thing being an activist. Being an activist, there are shareholder activists. There's all sorts of good activists that do good works and are really important in a pluralistic democracy. So it's a bad thing that he's even trying to smear that word, but he's doing it because he's trying to delegitimise legitimate community concern about an industrial activity that does not have our long-term interests at heart. I think this jobs point, no one is going to, when someone from the salmon farm industry said, we're providing really important jobs, it's like, well, of course, any job is important in Highlands and Islands. That is just a fact. No one, and it's very hard to speak up about, the impacts, the wider cumulative impacts of those jobs in the industry that they're sort of underpinning. No one wants to call out their neighbour. That's a hard thing culturally to do. But, we have got a concern about the long-term resilience of these jobs, because there are going to be, there's already, the cracks are showing, and have been showing for a long time in this industry. And for Salmon Scotland to be ignoring that is really worrying, because I don't think they're doing their own industry, their own workforce, any favours at all. And that's a major problem.
Having listened to the podcast with Ben Hadfield, what did you glean from it? Any hope, or just more scepticism? Are you more entrenched than ever?
The statements being made are really not supported in evidence, and some of the statements are really regrettably misleading. So, for example, I think Ben described the modelling architecture for the sea lice issue as totally unreasonable, and that the risks through that modelling architecture were being exaggerated by 4 to 5 times, I think was the numbers he chose. And since he must have said those words, the chief scientific advisor for Scotland published a report saying that any claim of misrepresentation of scientific findings by the regulator, i.e. SEPA, is unfounded. And so, wow. I think that issue has been put to bed. The modelling architecture that SEPA has chosen is not exaggerating the risk. And, that has been a big, long-standing issue, as many will know. One of the major drivers of wild salmon decline, as an impact of salmon farming, is the transfer of sea lice parasites to wild salmon. And it's very, very difficult. It's very complex science to prove that sea lice from a particular farm is having that particular impact.
Sure.
And so these models are obviously by nature hypothetical, but we've got to do something about it, and we need some precautionary approach to manage that risk. And I think that Ben's statements in relation to the sea lice issue signal that that they are not prepared to accept a precautionary approach to the management of their industry, when all the science says there's an impact, there's a real impact of sea lice on wild salmon, and we need to get on top of it. So we think that the model is it fails to consider some of the cumulative impacts of fish migrating through different zones and so on. But the central point is that Ben has prevaricated on this issue. Sorry, not Ben, but so the salmon farming industry has prevaricated on the sea lice issue for many years, and is now appealing and stalling the implementation of that regulation through the courts in a pretty cynical manner, and it's leaving the regulation of the sea lice issue, in a worse place than it was before. And that is not an industry acting in good faith in our view. And I think it's also again important to recognise that every time an escape incident happens, the timer sort of resets, and we've got more farmed fish being introduced into natural populations. So this idea of it sort of diminishing over time is sort of kind of irrelevant when you consider these escape incidents continue to happen year on year.
We have a culture here of very, very low regulation. It's just coming to the fore that perhaps these farms, these practices of open net salmon farms certainly need much tighter and much more robust regulation in defence of the environment and the wild salmon stock in particular. The regulators will argue that if they're being honest, they'll say they're underfunded. If they're being political, they'll say it's all in hand.
And I think it is not simply, but in large part because of a very effective and quite aggressive corporate lobby, which is trying to over-egg its sort of indispensability to rural Scotland when there are other ways of harvesting our seas. And they are trying to make this industry supposedly indispensable. Do we want salmon farming in 50 years' time? Is this the way to produce food from our sea? I think most people do not think that this is a long-term industry that's going to survive a whole range of pressures that are coming down the line, but they are convincing government, time and time again in the short term that these jobs are essential for votes. And there are other ways to generate jobs in the Highlands and Islands other than salmon farming, and I think that they're providing a convenient solution to a rural employment pressure that they don't need to just look to the salmon farmers to solve. And there's not an overview of all the externalities of this industry. And I found, that despite the fact that, yes, okay, there are jobs in salmon farming in the Skye and Loch Alsh area, that, up to 28% of them are not net jobs, i.e. there are a number of jobs that have been impacted because salmon farming set up shop in that area. Sure. And they are people like inshore fishers, they are people like shellfish farmers, they are people like maybe in the marine tourism sector, certainly in wild fishing as well, Jim, people who have for a long time benefited from healthy salmon populations and all the associated revenues that come from those healthy wild populations.
The government aren't recognising that as any sort of metric. I appreciate this huge ripple effect. It's not as binary as we create loads of jobs, what's wrong? Because, as you say, so many other industries get affected and so many jobs are lost and livelihoods and cultures damaged. Ailsa, you used to work on a fish. How long did you work on a fish farm for?
Probably about a year, but then after that I was involved, as I said before, this tripartite working group where we would net post-smolts in the rivers. You'd have liked that, but netting salmon legally. And then counting the sea lice on them. And then we'd go out on the farms and count the lice there. And I also, for a period of time, audited for the RSPCA Assured scheme, which was looking at fish welfare. So, I was kind of anti-fish farm from a child because I spent a lot of time on the water and saw at that stage, because it's quite a long time ago, you would see the fish in the pens, they were smelly, they were a lot more visibly bad than they are now. But when I went and did my degree in marine science at SAMS, they were quite pro-salmon farming, and I was like, maybe I've been a bit close-minded. And I came out with more of an open mind. That was the first job I could get when I moved up to Ullapool. And I loved a lot of it. I like being outside, I love fish, I like looking after creatures. But I quickly realised that I was right. I was more right when I was 10 than I was when I came out of my degree with a so-called education.
Wow, that's interesting. And is that the reason why you left?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't. I suppose when I started, you get this thing drummed into you, it's food for people, until, it is not a sensible way to feed anybody, because you're using up food grade fish, or more quality oily fish that Ullapool was built on, to pelletise and feed it to a salmon. I mean, that's just a mad nonsense. And the chemicals involved. I think one of the things that really hit me was the cull grade in fresh water, because I worked in fresh water mainly. So you're looking after fish, they're graded into small, medium and large. I didn't know that small grade is effectively an emergency backup for if anything goes wrong with the bigger ones, and they'll all just be killed. So you might have been responsible for thousands and thousands of small grade fish in your row, and then the next thing you know, they're all getting culled and sent off to landfill. So the waste was phenomenal. And then auditing them, I thought, oh, maybe there's a way of making them pull up their socks, or a way of doing this better. And I firmly believe after doing that there is not a humane or ethical way of farming a migratory carnivorous fish in a small pen. And they can go on about how much room they've got in the pen if they want, but if they're not in a pen and they're wild, they've got the Atlantic. It just doesn't make any sense.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. Why are we farming a migratory carnivorous wild animal and domesticating it? Thank you, Ailsa. That was so insightful. We spoke on the previous episode with Ben about mortality, and we used cattle, or rather, I believe he used cattle as an analogy, as a comparison there. Cows, pigs, sheep. What did you feel about that argument, Nick?
I mean, I think it's easy to get drawn into that narrative or that comparison, but I find it just a real distraction. Salmon farming is different from other types of farming.
It's apples and oranges, isn't it? It really is apples. It's the weakest comparison I've certainly ever heard, but I just wanted to get your views on it too, because I thought it was ridiculous.
I think the bigger picture is that salmon farming is giving farming a bad name in Scotland. If I was a beef farmer in Scotland, I would be actually worried about salmon farming as an industry tainting the broader farming sector in Scotland, and and in the rest of the UK. It's not playing its role as a responsible food producer, and that's having that could have a broader reputational impact. And I think there is a real risk that they're trying to liken themselves to other meat production sectors, but they're not the same kind of entity. It's a very new production model, and it's quickly being found out, and it's quickly showing that it is not sustainable. And I think they're aware of that, and they are trying to squeeze as much out of that industry before the regulatory grips tighten.
I think so. I think salmon farming, the word farming, is the only thing that practice has in common with agriculture in the main in Scotland. And I think I think it's very convenient to be under that umbrella. And like you, I don't think it will last much longer. It's a very, very different practice. So Ben insisted that the majority of mortality, or the biggest percentage of mortality, came from environmental pressures such as climate change, jellyfish, algae, everything that comes off the back of the environment, and not things that they can control or try to control, such as lice or disease. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, this is just the crux of it, isn't it? If they can't control the environment, and the environment's changing for the worst for salmon, because waters are getting warmer here. If they can't control the environment, fish are going to suffer and die in that way, then they shouldn't be farming there.
Absolutely. So sticking on that point, and not everybody agrees. Everybody has opinions on the solutions around salmon farming. Some will say just stop it in entirety. I don't think personally, that's a viable option, because I don't think now the genie's out the bottle. I think there will always be salmon farming because of its lucrative nature. But we talk about closed containment, don't we, as solutions, and that's what a lot of lobbying is around. And Ben told us that they invest a lot of money in closed containments in the various forms that they come in, but also told us that at the moment they're not scalable. Economically, it's not viable. They're not tried and tested. They have their own side effects. What are your thoughts on closed containment, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, it's a red herring. The closed containment technology, or the semi-closed containment technology, however they're trying to brand it, is untested, and claims are being made about the supposed benefits of this technology that do not match reality. The sort of the epicenter of this debate was had in the application for a semi-closed salmon farm in Loch Long in the Clyde, and that was a very contentious application. Many parts of the community were very opposed to the application, and there was a lot of research done to assess whether or not the claims around this technology were supportable. And yeah, I dug out some really interesting information that was being presented at the time during that hearing, and some of the lobbying that was being done in parallel. And they were making claims that 85% of the waste from these salmon farms would be captured by the semi-closed tech. And actually, when it came to the appeal and the Scottish Government reporter hearing about this application, because it was initially refused by the local authority, their legal representative had to acknowledge that that no farm is offering 85%, and that it was more likely to be around 30 to 40%, and yet the conditions that SEPA were happy with were on the basis that the tech would deliver 85%, and so there's a lot of exaggeration, I think, about the benefits that this technology can deliver. And I don't know whether you followed what happened with that particular application, but the planning authority refused it. The applicant appealed, and the Scottish Government reporter also upheld that it was to be refused, and then it went into limbo land for a while, and Scottish ministers, by a ministerial decree, overrode that decision, and there just wasn't enough.
So what's the solution, Nick? What's the solution?
Stop salmon farming.
In entirety
to recovering wild salmon populations around the world,
yeah,
in Scotland, or
sorry, yes,
the solution?
Yes.
I mean, that's a big question.
It is. It's a huge question, but if it's not in closed containment, then is the only solution to absolutely put a moratorium on salmon farming across the globe, knowing how lucrative it is a protein source for millions and millions of people, they will argue.
I mean, a moratorium is a first step, because a moratorium is just to stop the expansion of this industry.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. Just as a quick aside, it's really important for all your listeners to know that the industry is still expanding in Scotland. Since a Scottish parliamentary inquiry 8 years ago determined that this industry really needs to sort itself out and to be better regulated. In those intervening 8 years, there's been, I think, 18 new farms been approved, many dozens of extensions to biomass. I think there's a more consented biomass of about 80,000 tonnes, and the industry has produced more salmon from Scotland, even when it's been acknowledged by our political representatives that this industry needs to tidy up its act. So that expansion continues. We're continuing to put in new farms all around our coastline, obviously not on the East Coast, but I think that's just really important to recognise. a moratorium
Yeah.
would be the least thing that we should be doing. There is still clear evidence that this industry is impacting the health of our wild salmon populations. It's a controllable pressure. We should not be adding to that pressure with more salmon farms. So we should definitely be stopping any new consents for salmon farms. That's a bare minimum. And as I think WildFish, formerly Salmon and Trout Conservation, took a step a few years ago of realizing that this is not just a kind of incremental regulatory, we can improve the situation and protect our wild salmon by improved regulation. This is an industry which is structurally incompatible with the protection of our wild salmon populations. And so, the solution is, I'm afraid, because it will be difficult to achieve, but the solution is to transition from this food production model, which we have become slightly reliant upon, to other methods of producing food and value in our rural economy, and come up with a vision that takes us away from it. It's not an overnight thing, but we need to think in 30, 40, 50 years' time, do we want salmon farming in Scotland and around the world? No, we do not. And the Canadians have figured this out. The Canadians are already removing salmon farms from key migratory corridors for their wild salmon populations. Our politicians in Scotland need to have that same level of vision that is being exhibited the other side of the Atlantic.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to move on to Ben's commitments that we discussed on the podcast with him. Ailsa, how do you feel about aquaculture? And I'm talking about salmon farming aquaculture here. Funding, research, getting involved in the conservation of wild salmon with their might, with their clout, with their checkbook.
I think they should 100% put a proportion of their money into that, but that they should not be the ones, like we talked about earlier, that get to dictate what happens, have their name against it. It's just the polluters pays principle. They pay for it. They don't get to get some good PR out of it.
Okay, that's interesting. What about you, Nick? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly the same. It should not be some sort of moment of discretionary largesse by the sector that they can either give or take away as they see fit. This industry should be taxed appropriately and penalised effectively in the form of financial, monetary fines when they pollute our environment and have harm on, the areas in which they're operating, and that money would fund the necessary work to protect and more effectively regulate our seas. It should not be being it really risks being a greenwashing exercise. The Wild Salmon Fund, as it currently exists, it does, fund some worthy river restoration work. There's no doubt about it. But, ultimately, it will be having an impact on people's ability to speak up about some of the negative impacts of salmon farming within their local area. And as we've discussed, that is one of the issues, that people need to be able to speak up about this issue.
Not be afraid to speak up. Yep. I couldn't agree more. I mean, how does the idea of imposing or introducing some sort of salmon levy, where aquaculture, for every kilogram of harvested fish or biomass produced, they have to pay X amount into a levy, which is then applied to for salmon restoration projects. How does that sound to you?
I mean, there is a lot of bureaucratic complexity to how you secure such a tax or levy. At the moment, salmon farm companies do not pay non-domestic rates, so business rates, on the salmon farms in the sea. Crazy situation. There was an exemption that was applied in the 1980s. The salmon farms first started taking off, and so they don't pay business rates like any other business in the Highlands, which does. They're exempted from those business rates. But there is complexity about how you would apply such a form of local taxation, and then obviously considerations as to who gets that money and how, and is it centralised and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean there is a sea fish applies a levy to seafood produced, so there are existing mechanisms that could be maybe refined and amended. But yeah, I wouldn't want to comment exactly on the best
Sure.
mechanism for.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement, aren't we, that aquaculture or open net salmon farming, let's be distinct here, need to significantly increase their investment, if you're going to call it that, into the protection of the environment in the main. And under that banner, we are talking about the conservation of the wild Atlantic salmon. It is my belief that what they currently invest, what they currently get away with investing is outrageous, it's unforgivable, and I think it might go some way to helping what we're all wanting here, which is to protect our environment, if they did take more accountability and invest way more in the damage they make, the polluter pays principle.
Yeah, I think that is a laudable initiative. I think what you could be, it would be good to hear from Salmon Scotland and the industry, in the sense that it'd be good if they gave assurances that they were not going to try and lobby for weaker penalties for the pollution that they create. So, for example, at the moment, there's never been no salmon farm in Scotland has ever been fined for allowing their fish to escape into the wild. That is an outrageous situation, and the Scottish Government knows that. They're going to start introducing legislation for that. It would be, those fines should be sky high. They should be so sky high that any farm operator really, really acknowledges that this is something that they do not want to see happen, and that they cannot just bring it into their business model, which is currently the case. That should bankrupt a company. If you're going to lose tens of thousands of fish, you shouldn't be able to operate that site for sure.
Yep. They need proper incentive, don't they? Proper regulatory incentive to not let these fish escape. But they will escape, Nick, as we've agreed. Yeah. They're going to escape because they can't beat nature in that respect. They can't beat the high seas. But I agree, absolutely, we need to be finding them per fish, I would say. Tell me, where's your favourite river or your favourite stretch of coastline up there where you'd like to continue to go and enjoy the surroundings?
I do actually have a favourite. It's my favourite place in the world on the low tide mark, that liminal area where the sea will come up and down, and I'm lucky enough that I work there quite a lot. But my favourite is Garvey Bay on the way to Achiltibuie, where sea trout do run up the little river, and you can see them jumping there often. And that is a really special place where you cannot see and you cannot hear a salmon farm.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Maybe we should, sounds like we should do an episode from there. It sounds idyllic. Nick, what about you?
I did prepare for this question, because I've listened to almost all of your excellent interviews and podcasts.
I'm blushing,
Nick.
I
guess I was taking it very literally, Jim, because I think if it was literally the last day on earth, I'd have to be with my wife, and I'd have to say that, and I would head to Argyll actually, and I'd probably head to the hillocks of Argyll, and
Nicola wouldn't like it.
Just take no. We've both been and we've both fished there, but we probably wouldn't take the rods. We'd probably just
hold each other
and leave. Yeah, exactly.
Hold each other. Go like this. Wait for the meteor to hit.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing you can't hear the drone of salmon pellet guns in the background when you're up there in those hillocks. Oh, thank you both. That was gorgeous. That was a gorgeous ending to what was sadly a pretty mucky conversation. Ailsa and Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. It really has been a really interesting and balanced counter to last week's episode with Ben Hadfield. My thanks to Nick and Ailsa. If you haven't already, I'd invite you to go back and have a re-listen to Ben Hadfield's episode and have a little think about how many of those promises that he made us are actually going to materialise. Because here at The Last Salmon, our breath is well and truly bated. If you found any of this useful, comment, share it, post on socials, get involved, keep the conversation going.